yourself to say your name and your organization's name in on your screen. This webinar is also being live streamed, and since we have quite a short period of time available for the panel, we might not be able to answer all your questions. So you can still put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will be responding to them using our social media handles, especially over Twitter. I think we'll be showing our social media handles on the screen in a second. I also wanted to just say that some of the content presented today might be triggering, as there might be references to gender-based violence and harassment. Please feel free to leave the webinar if you feel uncomfortable and join back when you're feeling better. This panel will feature labor leaders, movement lawyers, and researchers from across Asia who will be speaking about how the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated the existing crisis in the garment industry in Asia. They will provide the perspectives of the Asian labor movement and its activists who respond to this crisis on an everyday basis and offer urgent remedies and solutions that must inform the responses of global institutions and policymakers. There is overwhelming evidence to show that even in the pre-pandemic period, there was a crisis of poverty-level wages in the garment industry in Asia, which kept women workers who have worked for decades in the industry in a state of severe impoverishment. During the pandemic, this crisis was aggravated through heightened wage theft and related economic violence against women workers, which also triggered increased gender-based violence and harassment, not only in the factories, but in their homes and communities as well. This is an emergency with regard to not only labor rights, but socio-economic justice and the most basic of human rights. Trade unions and movement lawyers across Asia have formulated demands and are designing their own solutions and strategies that are drawn from their lived experiences and based on their proximity to the crisis. Initially, as the pandemic set in and fashion brands cancelled orders or acted in other ways that led to severe labor rights violations, including wage theft in their Asian supplier factories, AFWA, along with partner trade unions, wrote to brands demanding a supply chain relief contribution, an amount to be paid by brands down their supply chains to compensate for the wages lost by workers as a result of their actions. We soon realized that campaigning or bargaining strategies are simply not adequate, but that governance gaps in supply chains must be addressed in order to ensure the accountability of brands. Our panelists today will tell us how the Asian labor movement has been responding to this governance gap to build brand accountability in fashion supply chains for a just transition from the pandemic and towards a just future of work for garment workers. We're dividing the panel into 3 discussions. In the first discussion, we have with us Jiva M. Jiva is the General Secretary of the Tamil Nadu Textile and Common Labour Union, a Dalit women-led trade union representing 11,000 women workers in Tamil Nadu, India. Jiva, who hails from the Dalit community, has worked for more than 5 years in the textile industry, both as a garment worker and as a spinning mill worker. She was one of the founding members of the TTCU and has been leading struggles for decent work and violence-free workplaces for garment workers for more than a decade. She will provide a perspective of fashion supply chains and its problems from her position as a Dalit woman worker and union leader, and tell us about the changes that she and workers in her union are demanding. We also have with us Ashley Saxby, who is the Southeast Asia coordinator of AFWA. She also coordinates AFWA's GBVH program and is the main author of AFWA's recent report on GBVH and fashion supply chains during the pandemic. Ashley will build on Jiva's comments and provide an Asia-wide regional perspective of the crisis that garment workers have been experiencing as a result of the lack of brand accountability during the pandemic. Jiva will be speaking in Tamil. Live transcriptions will be visible when she speaks, so please enable it by clicking on the icon titled CC at the bottom of your screen and selecting the option to view subtitles. Over to you, Jiva.
அனைவருக்கும் வணக்கம். என் பேர் ஜீவா. நான் ஒரு தலித் சமூகத்தை சேர்ந்த பெண். டிடியூஸ்ல பொதுச் செயலாளராக இருக்கேன். இவ்வளவு பெரிய அமைப்புல ஒரு தலித்தோட பிரச்சனையை பேச வாய்ப்பு கொடுத்ததுக்கு நான் நன்றி தெரிவிச்சுக்கிறேன். உலக நாடுகள்ல இருக்க ஒவ்வொருத்தரும் ஒவ்வொரு நாளும் அவங்க உடுத்துற உடைக்கு பின்னாடி எங்களை போல தலித் பெண் தொழிலாளர்களுடைய புலம்பெயர்ந்த தொழிலாளர்களும் தலித் பெண் தொழிலாளர்களோட கண்ணீர்லையும் வேர்வையிலையும் ரத்தத்தை சிந்திதான் நாங்க அவங்களுக்கு உற்பத்தி பண்ணி தரோம்னு எத்தனை பேருக்கு தெரியும்? இதெல்லாம் விட நாங்க உடல் அளவுலயும் சரி மனதளவுலயும் சரி நாங்க ரொம்பவே பாதிக்கப்படுறோம். உடல் அளவுல எடுத்துக்கிட்டீங்கன்னா இன்னைக்கு நாங்க ஒரு ஆர்டரை முடிச்சு கொடுக்கணுங்கிறதுக்காக 12 மணி நேரம், அது எங்க 2 சந்ததிகளா நாங்க அந்த கார்மெண்ட்ஸ் தொழில இருக்கோம். 12 மணி நேரம் விடாது உழைப்பு. அது மட்டும் இல்லாம ஒரு பீரியட்ஸ் டயத்துல கூட எங்களால வீட்டுல வச்சுட்டு போற துணியை கூட மாத்த டைம் இல்லாம நாங்க எவ்வளவு அவதிப்படுறோம் தெரியுமா? ஒரு டீ பிரேக் எடுக்காம ஒரு சாப்பாட்டு டயத்துக்கு கூட எங்களால சரியா போகும். ஏன்னா போனா நம்மளுக்கு இந்த ஆர்டரை முடிச்சு கொடுக்க முடியாதே, அந்த டயத்துக்கு நம்ம முடிச்சு கொடுக்க முடியாதுங்கிற ஒரு சூழ்நிலைக்கு ஆயிருமோ, திட்டிடுவாங்களோங்கிற ஒரு பய உணர்ச்சியிலே நாங்க எந்த ஒரு யூரின் போறதுக்கு கூட நாங்க கேட்க முடியாத ஒரு சூழலுக்கு நாங்க தள்ளப்பட்டு இன்னைக்கு நாங்க அந்த இடத்துல ஒரு மென்சஸ் டயத்துல கூட நாங்க எங்களோட துணியை மாத்த கூட நேரம் இல்லாம, அந்த கொண்டு போன சாப்பாடு கூட சாப்பிட நேரம் இல்லாம நாங்க 12 மணி நேரம் உழைக்கிறோம். உழைச்சாதான் அந்த பிராண்டுக்கு அந்த டயத்துக்கு நாங்க முடிச்சு கொடுக்க முடியும். இதெல்லாம் விட நாங்க மென்சஸ் டயத்துல ஏற்படுற வகுத்து வலிக்கு அங்க கம்பெனில கொடுக்குற மாத்திரைகளை சாப்பிட்டா உடனே வலி குறையுது. ஆனா அது வலி குறைஞ்சாலும் அந்த டயத்துக்கு வலி குறைஞ்சிருச்சே, நம்ம வேலை பார்க்கலாமேன்னு சொல்லிட்டு நாங்க சந்தோஷமா வேலை பார்ப்போம். அதோட மாத்திரைகளோட அந்த கம்பெனில கொடுக்குற மாத்திரைகளோட விளைவு எங்களுக்கு அடுத்த மாசம் அதுக்கு அடுத்த மாசம் பீரியட்ஸ் நின்றோம். ஆனா அந்த டயத்துல நாங்க ஹாஸ்டல்ல இருக்க டயத்துல எங்களுக்கு அப்பா நம்ம வேலைக்கு லீவ் போடாம போலாம், அங்க போனோம்னா திட்டு வாங்காம நம்ம வேலை செய்யலாம் அப்படிங்கிற ஒரு சூழல்ல நாங்க சந்தோஷமா வேலை செய்யறோம். ஆனா அதோட விளைவுகள், அந்த மாத்திரைகளோட விளைவு, அந்த யூரின் போக முடியாததுக்கான விளைவுகள் எங்களுக்கு பின்காலத்துலதான் அது தெரியுது. ஏன்னு கேட்டீங்கன்னா நாங்க இதெல்லாம் வேலை செஞ்ச தளத்துல இருந்து முடிச்சு நாங்க வெளியில ஒரு கல்யாண ஸ்டேஜுக்கு போகையில எங்களோட அந்த யூரின் போக முடியாது, அந்த மாத்திரை சாப்பிட்டது எல்லாமே சேர்ந்து எங்களுக்கு என்ன ஆயிடுச்சு, ஒரு குழந்தைய கூட எடுக்க தகுதி இல்லாத ஒரு பெண்ணாதான் நாங்க நிக்கிறோம். அங்க உழைப்ப பூரா கொடுத்து எங்களோட ரத்தத்துல எல்லாத்தையும் ரத்த சோகை அது இதுன்னு எல்லாம் எங்களுக்கு ஏற்பட்ட சூழல்ல நாங்க வெளியில வர்றோம். வெளியில எங்களுக்கு அந்த மாத்திரைகள் சாப்பிட்டதுனால யூரின் சரியா போகாம, சாப்பிடாதனால ரத்த சோகை ஏற்படுது. அது மட்டும் இல்லாம இந்த மாத்திரைகளோட எஃபெக்ட் பெண்களோட கர்ப்பப்பைய பாதிக்கிறதுங்கிறத எங்களுக்கு இப்பதான் தெரியும். இவ்வளவு நாளைக்கு அப்புறம் அதோட ஒரு ட்ரீட்மெண்ட் எடுத்ததுக்கு அப்புறம் தான் அந்த மாத்திரைகள் அப்ப சாப்பிட்டதுனாலதான் இன்னைக்கு நாங்க ஒரு தாய்மை அடைய முடியாத ஒரு சூழ்நிலைக்கு நாங்க இருக்கோங்கிறது எங்களுக்கு இப்பதான் தெரியுது. இதே மாதிரி எத்தனை பெண்கள் அந்த மாதிரி இருக்காங்க தெரியுமாங்க? அதுல நானும் இன்னைக்கு ஒருத்திங்கிறத நான் இந்த இடத்துல நான் சொல்லிக்க விரும்புறேன். மன ரீதியா எங்களுக்கு என்னென்ன பாதிப்புகள் ஏற்படுதுன்னா, ஒரு வேலை தளத்துல ஒரு சின்ன தவறு பண்ணிட்டாலோ அல்லது ஏதோ ஒரு சூழல்ல ஒரு லீவ் கேட்டாலோ செஞ்சாலோ தகாத வார்த்தையில திட்டுறது, எங்களை பாலியல் துன்புறுத்துறது, இதெல்லாம் எங்களால வெளியே சொல்ல முடியாம இல்லைங்க. சொன்னா வேலை போயிரும், எங்களால வேலை போச்சுன்னா சாப்பாட்டுக்கு கஷ்டப்படணும், கடைக்காரங்க திட்டுவாங்கிற ஒரு சூழல்ல இதை நாங்க வெளியிலேயே சொல்றது இல்லை. அதோட பாலியல் தொந்தரவு எங்களை மாதிரி தலித் பெண்களுக்கு தாங்க அதிகமா அங்க நடக்குது. ஏன்னு கேட்டீங்கன்னா, தலித்தை தொட்டா யாரு கேட்பா, எவங்க கேட்க போறாங்க, இவங்களை தொட்டா யாரு எதுவும் கேட்க மாட்டாங்கிற ஒரு ஆண் ஆதிக்கத்திலே எங்களை அவங்க தலித்தை ரொம்பவே கேவலமா பார்த்து பேசி எங்களை, அது மட்டும் இல்லாம ஈஸியா எங்களை பாலியல் தொந்தரவு பண்ணிடுறாங்க. ஏன்னா நாங்க இதை வெளியில சொல்ல மாட்டோம். சொன்னா யாரு எங்களுக்காக கேட்க போறா, தலித்துக்காக யார் கேட்பா அப்படிங்கிறதுனால அவங்க ஈஸியா எந்த ஒரு வேலை தளத்திலுமே தலித்துனாவே எங்களை நாயை விட கேவலமா தாங்க பாக்குறாங்க அந்த இடத்துல எங்களைய. அதே போலதான் இப்ப எங்க தலித் இனத்தை சேர்ந்த ஜெயஸ்ரீயோட கொலையும் அது மாதிரிதாங்க. இன்னைக்கு அதே ஜெயஸ்ரீக்கு ஏற்பட்ட நிலைமை வேற ஜாதி பெண்ணுக்கு ஏற்பட்டிருந்தா அரசியல் ரீதியாகவும் அவங்க ஜாதி ரீதியாகவும் எவ்வளவோ ஒரு இதா இருந்திருக்கும். ஆனா தலித்துங்கிறதுனால அந்த பிரச்சனை இந்த ஒரு வருஷமா அது எங்க டிடிசி எடுத்து நாங்க தொழிற்சங்கமா இருக்க போய் நாங்க எடுத்து எங்க பிற அமைப்புகளை சேர்ந்து எடுத்து நடத்தினால மட்டும்தான் நாங்க ஜெயஸ்ரீயோட கேஸ்ல, அது ஒரு தலித்தோட கேஸ்ல நாங்க இவ்வளவு ஜெயிச்சு வெளியில வந்திருக்குதுன்னா அது முழுக்க டிடிசியோடையும் பிற அமைப்புகளும் சேர்ந்து வேலை செஞ்சனால மட்டும்தான் நாங்க இவ்வளவு வெளியில வந்திருக்கோம். பாலியல் தொந்தரவு முழுக்க தலித்தை டார்கெட் பண்ணிதான் இந்த பாலியல் தொந்தரவு எல்லா கார்மெண்ட்ஸ்லயும் சரி, எல்லா கம்பெனிகள்லயும் சரி, எங்களை மாதிரி ஒரு தலித்தின பெண்களுக்கு தான் ஏற்படுது. எங்களை மாதிரி புலம்பெயர்ந்த தொழிலாளர்களுக்கு, வடமாநில பெண்களுக்கு இது வந்து நிறையவே நடக்குது. அது வந்து வெளியிலே தெரிய மாட்டேங்குது.
Hello everyone, I'm Jeeva, the General Secretary of TTCU. I'm from the Dalit community. I'm grateful to speak about Dalit workers' issues here. Thank you for having me in this important program today. I'm here to inform you the situation of Dalit women textile workers who produce for global fashion brands that you may be using every day. The fashion industry came with the promise of women empowerment. However, it today runs on the blood and sweat of women, particularly poor, Dalit, and migrant women. Women in our families have worked for more than 2 generations in the garment industry, working more than 12 hours, 6 days a week with no job contracts or social security. Many in our communities suffer from grave illnesses after working in the fashion industry, after being denied bathroom breaks, after standing for long hours ironing clothes, after being forced to take pills to delay our periods, so that productivity and profits of fashion brands won't be affected. I can't have children because of the pills I was forced to have in the garment factory. This upsets me terribly. We and our sisters have had to face harsh words, beatings, and sexual harassment regularly, unable to raise our voices as we feared we will lose our jobs. Jayashree Kadarvel, a sister, a fellow union member, and a Dalit garment worker, was raped and murdered during the pandemic. She would not have had to face this fate if she was not a Dalit woman. We could only fight for her justice only because of this union which represents Dalit workers. Otherwise, this case would also have not been heard by anyone. We have had to forgo our sleep, our need to eat, our need to use a toilet, just so that brands can have their clothes stitched and ironed on extremely short time spans, which they unilaterally decide.
உடல் ரீதியாவும் நாங்க மன ரீதியாவும் இவ்வளவு கஷ்டத்தை நாங்க அடைஞ்சு இந்த கொரோனா காலகட்டத்துல எவ்வளோ ஒரு சாப்பாட்டுக்கு மருத்துவத்துக்கு எவ்வளோ ஒரு சூழல்ல நாங்க தள்ளப்பட்டோம் தெரியுமாங்க. அப்ப கூட இந்த பிராண்ட் எங்களால பலலாம் அடைஞ்சாங்க. அவங்க ஏன்னு கூட கேட்கல எங்க தொழிலாளர்கள் உயிரோட இருக்காங்களா இல்லையா. இதே ஆசியாவில நாங்க அதிக அளவுல கார்மெண்ட்ஸ் தொழிலாளர்கள் தான் ரொம்பவே பாதிக்கப்பட்டு உயிர் இழந்திருக்காங்க. இந்த பொறுப்பு வந்து பிராண்டா தான் சேரும். இந்த 3 மாச காலத்துல நாங்க எவ்வளவு கஷ்டப்பட்டோம் தெரியுமாங்க. நாங்க எங்களோட கற்பை இழந்து, எங்களோட உடல் உழைப்பை இழந்து, எங்க மரியாதையை இழந்து, இத்தனையும் நாங்க இழந்து அவங்களுக்காக நாங்க எவ்வளவு பாடுபட்டு டீ டைம் எடுக்காம எந்த பிரேக்குமே நாங்க எடுக்காம அவங்களுக்காக பிராண்டுக்கு நாங்க அந்த ஆர்டரை சீக்கிரம் முடிச்சு கொடுக்கணுங்கிறதுக்காக நாங்க எங்களோட உழைப்பை எவ்வளவு கொடுத்துருக்கோம். ஆனா எங்களுக்காக அவங்க வந்து ஒரு 3 மாசத்துல எங்க கொரோனா காலத்துல கூட எங்களுக்கு வந்து 1 மாசம் சம்பளத்தை கொடுக்க கூட அவங்க முன் வரலங்க. எங்களை மாதிரி தொழில் சங்கங்கள் பிற அமைப்புகள்லாம் அவங்கள்ட்ட கேட்டு கூட காது கொடுத்துதான் கேட்டாங்க கழிச்சு எங்களுக்காக அவங்க வந்து ஏன்னு கூட கேட்கல. ஆனா இந்த கொரோனா டயத்துல வந்து அதிக பாதிக்கப்பட்டது வந்து கார்மெண்ட்ஸ் தொழிலாளர்கள் தான். பாதிக்கப்பட்டதோட மட்டும் நிக்கலங்க. அவங்க வந்து பிராண்ட் வந்து அந்த இடத்துல வந்து ஆர்டரை கேன்சல் பண்ணிட்டு போனதும் எங்களுக்கு பெரிய ஒரு இதா இருக்குங்க. ஆனா உளைச்சலையா ஏற்கனவே நாங்க வேலை இல்லாம இருக்கோம். அந்த 3 மாசம் சாப்பாட்டுக்கு எல்லாத்துக்கும் கஷ்டப்பட்டு இருக்க நேரத்துல இவங்க ஆர்டரையும் கேன்சல் பண்ணி போயிட்டாங்க. ஒரு மனிதாபிமானம் கூட இல்லாம கேன்சல் பண்ணிட்டு போனாங்க. அப்ப நாங்க அவ்வளவு நாள் அவங்களுக்காக எங்க உடலை வருத்தி, எங்க மனதை வருத்தி, நாங்க எங்க கற்பை கூட இழந்து நாங்க அவங்களுக்கு ஒரு டீ பிரேக் எடுக்காம எது எடுக்காம அவங்களுக்கு ஆர்டர் அந்த குறிப்பிட்ட நேரத்துக்கு முடிச்சு கொடுத்தது எங்க மேல தப்பா இல்ல நாங்க அவங்களுக்கு நேர்மையா உழைச்சது எங்க மேல தப்பான்னு தான் நாங்க கேட்கிறோம். அவங்க லாபம் சம்பாதிக்க நாங்க இவ்வளவு கஷ்டப்பட்டு எங்களுக்காக அவங்க ஒரு மாசம் சம்பளத்தை கொடுக்க கூட முன் வரலங்க. இதெல்லாம் விட இந்த எங்களுக்கு போதுமான சம்பளம் நாங்க 12 மணி நேரம் உழைக்கிறதுக்கு எங்களுக்கு சம்பளம் போதுமான அளவு கொடுக்குறாங்களா? அதுவும் கிடையாது. இந்த சம்பள குறைவும் வந்து அது பிராண்ட தான் சரி. எங்களுக்கான சம்பள குறைவையும் வந்து பிராண்டு தான் பொறுப்பு. சம்பள குறைவுன்னா இதெல்லாம் விட எங்களுக்கு கொரோனா காலத்துல அவங்க ஆர்டர் கேன்சல் பண்ணிட்டு போனதுதாங்க ரொம்ப ஒரு மன வருத்தத்திலேயே இருக்கு. எங்க குரல் வந்து என்னைக்குமே ஓயாது. எல்லா விதமான பாதுகாப்பு எங்களுக்கு வேணும். எல்லா விதமான சூழல்கள் பாதுகாப்பான சூழல் வேணும். எங்களுக்கு நிரந்தரமான கூலி வேணும். கொரோனா காலத்துல இது மாதிரி நாங்க எப்போதும் நாங்க விட்டுட்டு போக மாட்டோம். எங்களால இனிமேல் எந்த தொழிலாளர்கள் பாதிக்கப்பட மாட்டாங்க மாட்டாங்கிறத நாட்டு உறுதி செய்யற வரைக்கும் எங்களோட குரலை நாங்க வந்து ஒழிச்சுக்கிட்டு தான் இருப்போம். எங்களுக்கான நிரந்தரமான எங்களுக்கான நியாயமான கூலி கிடைக்கிற வரையும் நாங்க வந்து போராடிக்கிட்டு தான் இருப்போம். என்ன போன்ற தலித் சமூக பெண் தொழிலாளர்களுக்கு சரி, புலம்பெயர்ந்த தொழிலாளர்களுக்கு சரி, உரிய சம்பளம் வேணும், எங்களுக்கு வந்து பாதுகாப்பு வேணும், எங்களுக்கு பாதுகாப்பு வேணும், சமூக பாதுகாப்பு வேணும், எங்களுக்கு வந்து சம்பள உயர்வு வேணும். கொரோனா காலத்துல இப்ப விட்டுட்டு போன மாதிரி எங்களுக்கு எப்போதும் அவங்க விட்டுட்டு போக கூடாதுங்கிறத பிராண்ட் எங்களுக்கு வந்து உறுதி செய்யணுங்கிறத நான் ஒரு தலித் பெண் தொழிலாளரா இந்த இடத்துல நான் கேட்க, நான் வந்து எங்களை போல எந்த தொழிலாளரும் பாதிக்கப்படக்கூடாதுங்கிறத நான் இந்த இடத்துல நான் சொல்லிக்க நான் விரும்புறேன். தலித் சமூக பெண் தொழிலாளர்களுக்கு இவ்வளவு தூரம் எங்களுக்கு ஆதரவு கொடுத்து எங்க தொழிலாளர்களுக்குங்கிற ஒரு ஆதரவு கொடுத்த அனைத்து அமைப்புக்கும் நான் இந்த இடத்துல நான் நன்றி சொல்ல கடமைப்பட்டிருக்கேங்க. நன்றி.
Yet, after giving our bodies and our entire lives to this industry, we were left to starve during a global pandemic by the very brands that made profit after profit, day after day, month after month, for decades using our labor. While brands made profits even during a pandemic, even after working day in and day out, we, the workers who made the clothes they sold, had no savings. We had no money. Are we to blame for this? Did we not work hard enough? Do we not deserve to stay alive during a pandemic? Do Dalit women's lives not matter? As brands cancel orders and suppliers refuse to pay wages, we could not afford food for our children. We could not send them to school. We could not buy them medicines that would determine if our parents would survive another month. We and our sister trade unions wrote letters and organized campaigns demanding brands that they at least provide us with 2 months of wages, which were lost during the COVID-19 lockdown in 2020. The brands heard us, but chose to ignore our demands. But we workers cannot allow them to remain deaf to our fundamental rights, our right to life, our right to decent work, our right to safety and security. We will continue to raise our voices and say that we deserve living wages, that the poverty level minimum wages determined by brand practices almost starved 1 million garment workers to death across Asia during a global pandemic, that brands must be held liable for the wage theft of Asian garment workers, and no garment worker must endure what we and our sisters suffered during the pandemic. We hope you will all continue to stand in solidarity with us, Dalit women garment workers, as we continue the fight for human rights, respect, and dignity for all garment workers everywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jiva, for your strong words and for providing us that important understanding and reminding us of the core demands of garment workers. As Jiva rightly mentioned, millions of garment workers and their households have been facing human rights violations because of the purchasing practices of brands that never allowed for the payment of living wages. And millions more were pushed into starvation during the pandemic because of these same purchasing practices. These demands have become even more urgent now as we discuss remedies for the pandemic crisis. We believe that these demands coming from workers and their leaders must form the center of policy making and the designing of interventions to protect labor and human rights in supply chains. I now call on Ashley, who will build on Jiva's perspective with AFWA's research and data collected over the past 2 pandemic years.
Thank you, Nivedita. And yeah, thank you to General Secretary Jiva as well for that powerful statement. And, I extend my deepest solidarity to you. There were a number of important points we just heard. Would you, next slide, please? Yeah, Jiva raised a number of important points about the working conditions in the garment sector, including poverty level wages that keep workers at or just above the poverty level, health issues arising from long-term exposure to chemicals and having to stand for long hours, flexible employment arrangements, creating job insecurity, lack of employer-based social protection and social security, and deprivations of liberty, such as being prevented from taking toilet breaks and other forms of gender-based violence and harassment. Next slide, please. So what we find is that this is really a broader phenomenon found in every Asian country where garments manufacturing takes place. And this is because these conditions found in the garment industry are tied to the structure of global garment supply chains, in which brands who wield immense power over suppliers are creating this environment of intense competition, driving the cost of labor down, what has been termed the race to the bottom. And also because there is a lack of regulation, these power relations continue, enabling brands to pay lip service to certain international norms, but they're not bound by any law. And as Jiva pointed out, this enables brands to amass super profits, while the share that goes to workers is just a tiny fraction. And during the pandemic, this also enabled brands to suppress production costs even further by canceling or reducing orders, refusing to pay or delaying payments for completed orders, and demanding deep discounts and shorter lead times. Next slide, please. So we conducted research across 6 Asian garment production countries looking at wage theft, which we define broadly as any reduction in the monthly wages of workers in the pre-pandemic period compared to the average monthly wages before the pandemic, and also looking at the human rights impacts of this. So we surveyed over 2,000 workers from 189 factories in 6 countries, and together they lost a total of 157 million USD as wage theft. And on the next slide, this table, you can see in each country wage theft in terms of average wage theft per factory, the actual amount of wage theft by the workers that we surveyed, and then the estimated wage theft according to the total number of workers in the supplier factories that we surveyed as well. And so, this wage theft and the long-term failure of brands to pay a living wage meant that workers didn't have any savings. So in the pandemic, we see catastrophic consequences for workers. Next slide, please. So, we found that 2/3 of the surveyed workers were pushed below the World Bank poverty line in their countries during the peak pandemic months. And as a result, workers were forced to take on debt for basic consumption, for food, paying rent, schooling for their children, healthcare, medicine. And next slide, in this table, you can see a cross-country comparison in the percent reduction of work days, the percent average loss of wages, the percentage of workers pushed below the poverty line, as well as the increased debt taken on by workers. Next slide, please. So in the second research we conducted, documenting women garment workers' experiences of gender-based violence and harassment during the pandemic, we expanded on the wage theft that occurred by looking at economic harm. And this concept, economic harm, has been identified by the ILO in its Convention 190 on violence and harassment as a form of GBVH. And this is so crucial because we see how economic harm perpetuates other forms of GBVH and also increases women's vulnerability to violence. Next slide, please. So, we heard from so many women garment workers in how verbal abuse, physical violence, sexual harassment increased in factories and increased violence in women's homes and communities as well. And not only this, but we saw how mental health, next slide, please. We also saw how mental health was severely impacted. We documented numerous personal accounts of women who spoke of depression, stress and anxiety, and even suicidal ideation as a result of the increased work intensity, economic insecurity, and the associated rise in gender-based violence, in addition to the virus itself. So this phenomena we call embodied drama, which is arising from the verbal, physical, and sexual abuse and extreme economic-based anxiety, which has these long-term and deep impacts that are carried in the body and mind. Next slide. And such impacts are a result of what we call the garment industrial trauma complex, to capture how extreme corporate greed contributes to women's experiences of working in the garment sector. These daily experiences of violence and economic insecurity compounded by what they had to endure during the pandemic. Next slide. So given the realities of asymmetrical power relations in global supply chains and the lack of regulation, as well as the decades-long failure of brands to pay a living wage, and the human rights violations as a result of wage theft and the escalation of gender-based violence, these were predictable, unfortunately. And what our research really made clear is that we need transformative change in global supply chains. And to also reiterate what Jiva stated, brands have to ensure a living wage to workers, They must do this by compensating the gap between national minimum wages and living wage so that workers can lead a life of dignity. And in order to accomplish this, brand liability as joint employers is so crucial. And that's my time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ashley. What Jiva and Ashley shared with us today throws up a really important question: whether fashion supply chains in their current structure are delivering on their promise of development, quality employment, and women's empowerment, or are they pushing marginalized women workers deeper into poverty? As Jiva said, the need for a living wage was made even more clear by the pandemic crisis. But instead of providing solutions, brand actions created a further disintegration of wages. Workers were left with no legal recourse, no way to hold brands accountable for their actions during this crisis. It was left to global South governments and suppliers with razor-thin margins to deal with the crisis and support impoverished workers, even as they were dealing with a massive public health crisis with limited resources. And so obviously they were not able to provide workers the support that was required. As Ashley pointed out, across Asia, brands abdicated their responsibility towards workers who have been producing their clothes for decades without any accountability, because workers in the unions were faced with no legal recourse and no regulatory mechanisms to hold brands liable. This brings us to our next discussion, where we will be hearing from movement lawyers in Asia on how the Asian labor movement has been responding to the governance gaps in fashion supply chains. First, we will hear from Swastika Arunagam. Swastika is a lawyer and the Deputy General Secretary of the Commercial and Industrial Workers Union in Sri Lanka. A long-time labor and human rights activist, Swastika has filed complaints for Sri Lankan labor unions against global fashion brands for the massive wage theft of Sri Lankan garment workers during the pandemic. Along with her, we have Andy Muttakian, who is the Deputy Director of ELSAM, the Institute for Policy Research and Advocacy, a human rights organization based in Jakarta. He is a licensed attorney focusing on issues of business and human rights, and he has been very closely involved in providing legal aid and support for victims of land conflicts and plantation companies. Swastika will be speaking to us about the Joint Employer Liability Legal Strategy, a new strategy that was developed by AFWA and partner trade unions across Asia to hold brands legally liable as joint employers of workers using Asian production country laws and appealing to national jurisdictions in these countries to hold brands liable along with their suppliers for the wage theft facing workers. Over to you, Swastika.
Thank you, Nivedita. I was listening to Jiva and how she was talking about women workers. They are forced to take pills which would disturb their period cycles. They're not allowed to go use the toilets in order to work that 12 hours, in order to produce that garment. And she also spoke about how, despite all of them destroying their physical and mental health to produce this garment, when the pandemic struck, brands just washed their hands off as if they and the workers do not have any connections. They just cut us off. And I was listening to her and thinking how similar Jiva's experience and those similar experience we had in Sri Lanka as well. When the pandemic broke out, workers were stranded overnight in the free trade zones. Workers were left to starve. I mean, literally, they were left to starve. Unions stepped in to help workers in a very limited sense, but brands essentially cut us off literally overnight when the pandemic broke out. And the consequence of that, the consequences of that was ultimately suffered not by the suppliers, not by the brands, but by workers who had worked so hard to produce these garments. So despite the fact that even before the pandemic, many of us working with the labor movement in trade unions, lawyers, we have been talking about the nexus between brands and employees in third world countries in the supply chain, and how, despite the fact that brands have been hiding behind these middle suppliers in evading their liability as employers, for some of us who have been, as you said, AFA, who have been developing this concept of joint liability, has been very obvious to us that the ultimate power holder in the supply chain, the ultimate employer in the supply chain is not only the supplier, but also the brands. This was, however, not apparent to the rest of the larger society in general until the pandemic, when brands literally broke off from the supply chain overnight and workers were stranded. They did not have jobs, they did not have wages. And I think the pandemic kind of exposed and brought to light the direct relationship between brands and employees in countries like Sri Lanka, in third world countries. And that's when it was much more easier for us to also take this idea forward in filing complaints with the Labor Department, and really looking back at our labor laws, which talk about, which has a very expansive definition of who an employee is. So that's what we did. That's what we did in Sri Lanka. That's what we did in other Asian countries, where we went back to our labor laws and looked at what we can do to hold brands accountable to its employees who are producing for it, who is manufacturing for it. And when we looked into our labor laws, we realized that the definition of employer is in our labor laws, even though it's quite old, it's very expansive, which can include brands. And in fact, brands in their manufacturing contracts have these very grandiose declarations that they respect labor laws, local labor laws, and so on. But what does that mean in practice? What that means in practice is brands need to be held accountable. Brands should be accountable to what is happening to workers who are producing their garments, which they're selling and obtaining profits from. So that's what we try to do. We filed 2 complaints in the Labor Department under this framework of joint liability, under this concept of joint liability. I believe similar initiatives have been taken in India and Indonesia as well. And I'm also hearing that in Bangladesh and Pakistan also similar ideas are being developed. And we are hoping that through these ideas, we can obtain tangible benefits for our workers, because Sri Lanka is going through an economic crisis. And we are going through an economic crisis. And once again, when a country goes through an economic crisis, the people, the group which would be affected the most is the most vulnerable in our society. As Jiva was saying, the Dalit community who are working in the garment sector are the ones who are most affected in India. Likewise, in Sri Lanka, it is the garment workers who are working in the free trade zones, who have very little protection, who have very little union protection because of anti-union practices which are rife in the free trade zones, who will be affected the most, particularly in a time when Sri Lanka is going through an economic crisis. So we are hoping these strategies would eventually strengthen workers to obtain something tangible in situations of crisis. And we're also calling upon South Asian governments to not fall into this trap of, race to the bottom, to not fall into that trap, because the answer to attracting more investments is not to weaken our labor laws, to make our labor laws flexible so that our workers will be affected. The answer to that is not that. The answer to that is an Asian solidarity, an Asian coming together to counter these practices of brand exploitation. So we are also calling out Asian governments to come together to counter this exploitative practice of brands. And we are hoping that this collective effort would reverse this practice which has gone on and on for several decades, whereby the most vulnerable in the supply chain, the workers, have been exploited again and again, and while brands make profits out of this exploitation. Thank you. Nivedita?
Thank you. Thanks, Swastika, for giving us that perspective. And what we're hearing from you is that, there are systems, there are laws in place in Global South, in Asian countries, to respond to this notion that, there is a vacuum of laws. There is nothing here that can, be used to hold brands liable. And to even challenge this notion that brands are merely buyers of garments produced in Asia, that they have no responsibility towards the workers who produce those garments. And we have been litigating now to make this a reality, make brand accountability a reality, and call brands what they are, that is joint employers of workers in their supply chains. These are really important measures to build brand accountability. And I hope that global policy spaces as well are hearing this and can learn from these innovative strategies and efforts by the Asian labor movement. Now we'll move on to our next speaker, Andy. Andy will tell us about his experiences supporting the labor and human rights movement in Asia using the existing due diligence mechanism available through the OECD. He will highlight to us the opportunities and the challenges presented by this mechanism and how it can be improved to better accommodate the needs of the Asian labor movement. Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, thank you, Nivedita. Thank you for the opportunity for this event. I will try to share my PowerPoint. So yeah, apologize, I cannot specifically tell more about the labor issues, but I will share to you about our experience in OECD complaints mechanism, what we learned from Indonesian CSOs. So Indonesia, as one of the countries with a large number of business operating, civil society, and as well as the labor unions, I can say that we are quite often make complaint through the OECD mechanism. And we note that at least last 5 years, the most complaints received by the OECD from Indonesia are cases related to the land issues, indigenous peoples, and with the companies and financial institutions being complained. But however, more than last decade, we know that the first who make a complaint with the OECD mechanism comes from Indonesia is comes from labor unions. It is about the labor rights violation in the Nike and Adidas suppliers in Indonesia, 2002. Those case, both case is the status is failed. The complaint are rejected. I'm not sure about the argument from their final statement of the OECD. This is the last 3 years of the complaint from Indonesia. We can see that almost our cases are related about the natural resources, palm oil plantation, and also one of them are they are with the mining issues, mining sector. Only one cases where in 2018 there are clean cloth campaigns with the organization from Indonesia against Adidas with the labor rights violation in Indonesia supply chain. But the final statement, we note there are no resolution. I will explain more later. This is what ELSAM do in 2015. We try to challenge one of the biggest cement factory from Switzerland, because they have the land dispute, land cases in Blitar, in Java. We try to file a complaint to OECD mechanism. ELSAM with the Blitar Farmers Union and other NGOs. And however, it turned out that the complaint process to the Swiss NCP was not satisfactory. The result, because in the final segment, they return to the applicable mechanism in Indonesia. So they suggest us to solve our problem with our authority, Indonesian government, which is the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. It's very difficult for us because what we thought when we try to complain to the OECD is OECD can mediate us between the farmers and also the companies to solve immediately the problem. But OECD have a limited authority. They just can suggest us to solve our problem with our government. But we also note that there are positive, what we can take from the cases is when we go to OECD mechanism as an international brand, Holcim finally paid more attention to these cases, and they stated that they will improve their communication, their operation in Indonesia. And also they try to make another further dialogue with the farmer unions for cooperating in land management. And the second is, Holcim will develop further indicator on human rights because we have evidence that there are people existing in that land. So Holcim cannot it is you cannot agree about this, but you need to solve this problem. And the third is in the formal process, for the process in Indonesia, Holcim is willing to assist farmers in the process to the Ministry of Environment and Forestry to apply for land, because the farmers still want to ask their land back to them. This is at least the positive point what we got from the process. And another cases, I will share you about the clean cloth campaigns with the organization Indonesia against Adidas. It is the second complaint, because the point of the complaint is in July 2020, in 2012, workers at Panarup is part of the Panarup group. They strike to protest several negative human rights abuses by the factory. The factory respond by dismissing 130 of workers, and a lot of them still not to date receive their severance pay. And the second is Adidas has also contributed on the continuation of the human rights impact. And both parties actually agreed to take a mediation process, but in the process, what the complainant asked to NCP is, how about the investigation result, investigation method, and how about the evidence that Adidas should already take the progress about these issues. But the NCP asserted that Adidas expressed the firm view that for the focus and constructive continuation. And this is make the complainant frustrated, and it looks like NCP unwillingness to seek further information from Adidas. And then in April 2020, NCP concludes the case without agreement and issued its final statement. So no resolution from this process. And at least I can suggest this is for the improvement for the OECD, especially about the mechanism, from all of our cases in Indonesia. At least they need independent investigation. NCPs need to have the resource to conduct their own investigation. And second is friendly in language use. OECD should have at least the complaint or provide the translator, provide the interpreter in the dialogue and in the mediation, because the complaint mostly comes from certain countries, and for example, our cases, the farmers cannot understand about when we talk with the English language or other foreign language. And the third is implementation of agreement. We really appreciate the monitoring from the NCP on the final statement, but however, the execution result still lack coercive power. It's depending on the company and even more difficult when the state is involved, like in our cases. And the last is cost for mediation. The cost is too high. Yeah? The mediation is the mediation process is held in an NCP country location. This should be facilitated by NCP. At least one of the representative of the complainant should be facilitated by NCP or the OECD. Yeah, that's what I can share to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. You've really showed us how Asian activists have been using the OECD mechanism and the kind of barriers that they face, both in terms of accessibility to the process, as well as the process itself, with so few labor complaints actually being filed with the OECD, and that too with very little success. So we believe that your perspectives can really influence policy making and legislations around due diligence. And I think what we also take away from what you've said is that the Asian labor movement has a role to play in sensitizing due diligence mechanisms and these institutions, learn from the land rights movements, for instance, and contribute to these discussions. I think it is an important task for workers, for trade unions in Asia also to engage in these spaces so that they better respond to their needs. Thanks, Andy. And with that, we will now move on to a conversation between Sahiba Gill and Ocean Roy on the role of global institutions in addressing all the concerns and the perspectives that have been provided in the previous discussions by different actors in the Asian labor movement, who are all demanding stronger forms of brand accountability, including as joint employers of workers in supply chains. They will also be discussing how the OECD can actually play an important role in transforming brand accountability, including of all corporate actors, from brands to investors. Sahiba is a staff attorney at the Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum. She works with and for people in low-wage jobs who also cross state borders or work in global supply chains. Sahiba previously worked in supporting labor organizing among migrants from South Asia who work in the Arabian Gulf. Ocean Roy is a veteran trade unionist from India and serves as a member of the AFWA International Secretariat. For more than 3 decades, Ocean has worked to develop various legal, policy, and advocacy strategies to build collective power for low-wage workers and has advised trade unions and labor rights organizations on issues of workers' rights. Over to you, Sahiba and Ocean.
Thanks, Nivedita. And I should say thank you to the co-organizers for this opportunity to speak with Oshim and for all the perspectives today. Oshim, I think we can really just continue based on, Andy's presentation, which started to take us from grassroots to guidelines, right? In this case, it's really as applied to the clothing and footwear sector, which the OECD has a 2017 guidance on. And for context, and the reason why I think it's an exciting thing to talk about in the context of wages and all the truly devastating impacts that COVID-19 has had on workers, in particular on wages, is that the 2017 guidance does set out an expectation that wages should not only be minimum wages, right? They should be wages that satisfy the basic needs of workers and their families. And that certainly should include savings for a crisis like this pandemic that we've seen. And it certainly should have covered the pandemic itself. And of course, as we've heard today, that simply has not happened. And so on the one hand, there's an opportunity here. It seems, and you would know this very well, Oshim, that there has been tremendous work to get consensus around living wages as a standard. And yet, living wages remain, I understand from the Asia Floor Wage Alliance calculation, anywhere from 2 times to 5 times the minimum wage for garment workers. And as we've heard, garment workers have not even received that during the pandemic. So what role do you think that the OECD guidelines, and in particular, the guidances on due diligence in the clothing and footwear sector, have a role to play in getting justice for garment workers.
Thanks, Saiba, and thanks, Nivedita and everyone else for organizing this fantastic discussion. And I was really moved by Jiva's testimony of what really it means to my sister in Tamil Nadu and how they're facing this situation. I would really, talking about living wage looks like very far at this point when we are in a crisis of even getting the wages that was due in the pandemic period. So I'll focus on the pandemic period wage loss, or what I would call what the AFWA, which has very strongly said that it is a wage theft. Now, what is the implication of that from an OECD framework? And this is not only an AFWA wage viewpoint. This is, I mean, sense that there is a wage theft, which at this level of, on the global supply chain, and the scale of that has happened, has pointed out to one fundamental problem with the OECD framework. The fundamental problem is that there's a moral universe in which the brands and the partners of whoever is involved in the framing of the human rights exist. And suddenly this pandemic shows the distance the moral universe of the brands are from the concerns of the worker's life. I mean, what actually all this report has shown is a very simple thing. It's substantiated the fact that there's a slippage of people into poverty level, into indebtedness, massive dropout of children from school, return of the child labor into the labor market, extreme stress of the on women inflicted in the families and elsewhere. So what I would really argue here, that the moral consensus on which the OECD framework of guideline has been built up has actually broken and proved inadequate. I know this is a very strong word, but this is what the pandemic has shown. And so we need to bring out something more into this framework in order to make it workable. I would suggest the accountability of the brand has to be more for, even on statutory rights is actually obscured. Even on statute, the minimum wage was something every brands have said that they will give and commit. It's a legal standard. And yet the reality is that the workers in those companies failed to get the wages for the period they were going to be working there. Now, this is obscured by the nested contracts that shape the production regime in global supply chain. And I emphasize that we have to understand these nested contracts, because they allow for the evasion in absence of a very explicit regulation of the brand-supplier relationship. So I would suggest that we should really go back to really looking at the moral framework and the fundamental questions on which the OECD has been framed up. This is my first initial reaction to your question. Yeah.
I in many ways, I certainly share your frustration, and we could hear from the unions on this call how incredibly urgent this is, and yet how entrenched it is, how structural and persistent this problem seems to be. One thing that I have been frustrated by in looking at the news, over the past 6 months is just how profits for fashion, for clothing and footwear companies has just really returned to the pre-pandemic normal, even as for workers, there will no longer be such a thing as a return to a pre-pandemic normal, given the past 2 years of their working experience. I started to crunch some numbers, some simple calculations that are a back of the napkin calculation to compare some of the payouts that even were happening pre-pandemic to shareholders and compare those to a living wage. I think we have a slide if we're able to put it up because I was curious to understand, and this is something that we've been looking at Global Labor Justice International Labor Rights Forum. We know that publicly listed clothing and footwear companies are at the top of many supply chains. These companies are especially large, and they're answerable to shareholders. And shareholders include very large institutional shareholders that are effectively, major. You can think about them as major banks, and who really have driven companies to pay more and more of their profits over the past several decades to shareholders rather than returning them back, for example, to workers. And so, as I mentioned, living wages are roughly 2 to 5 times the current labor costs in clothing and footwear supply chains. And if you look at even the pre-pandemic period, which illustrates a trend that certainly we're seeing companies return to in the post-pandemic period, everything from buybacks, which is a form of stock manipulation to pay to raise the stock price and effectively pay shareholders more, and dividends, they represent anywhere from 2 to 5 times labor costs. That's something we saw for 10 public clothing and footwear companies. We've seen dividends that represent 2 to 3 times labor costs, which was the case for 7 publicly listed companies. And in the case of 4 public companies, we were seeing that together dividends and buybacks represent 4 to 7 times the existing labor costs. So if you compare that to what it would take to pay living wages, there's a clear choice that companies are making. They could be covering living wages to prevent the type of crises that we've been hearing have happened for workers, where they're truly asking brands, don't I deserve to live during a pandemic? That is a moral crisis. It's a global crisis that spans, boardrooms, trading floors to factory floors. And what does, Ashim, to your point, give me a little bit of hope despite this very dire situation is that the OECD guidelines similarly cover certain, institutional investor decisions to say that when those do contribute to human rights impacts like we've seen, there should be accountability and due diligence and ultimately remediation as well. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, what you have, it's actually hearing you and, having read this report, it just reinforces the point of how obnoxious this whole framework is becoming, to the extent that, we talk about stakeholder approach, and essentially you reduce your whole business model to a shareholder approach. And, this reality has to be recognized. For, in many ways, the global supply chain is projected as a tool of development. And what we just saw, that on one side, there's a wage theft. On the other side, there's a cut and run approach of the brands, which actually, again, show that there is, instead of a developmental framework, there's an extractive dimension that comes in the global supply chain, which is not regulated. Disengagement from sourcing firms, countries in pandemic time, abdicating the social responsibility. Even when the brands profited and accumulated reserves. This whole, I would say, the choice between deciding to enhance the market value of their shares instead of the humanitarian responsibility. If this could be, even in a humanitarian responsibility framework, if this could hold, I do not understand. And that's what Andy's presentation was, that we cannot hold those brands accountable in the existing OECD framework. This is a point that I need to stress. I would also say that 2 factors have to be recognized in the reality of the global supply chain as an emerging and the dominant economic reality of the thing. One, and this is very important, that if you don't have freedom of association and collective bargaining, that otherwise the globalization is not working. There'll be resistance, there'll be it is not working. Fair and just, there has to be freedom of association in the center of any regulation or any framework within the global supply chain. Second, and this is very important from a developmental perspective, there has to be a regulatory mechanism for fair competition. Asia Florwage and other researchers have shown that what is the monopoly condition in the global supply chain. And if you do not have a framework for a fair competition, that means unfair competition will come into existence. And that will mean there cannot be a positive developmental outcome from this kind of global supply chain framework. So is the OECD guidelines adequate enough to address these concerns? I'm afraid, and with a lot of experience of looking at last 10, 20 years, having myself fought many cases in the OECD NCP frame, I can only come to a conclusion that it is becoming very inadequate, and we have to address it seriously and in a more forthright fashion than we have done.
Well, I cannot argue with the experience. I think we've seen so critically today just how remedy is not reaching workers and justice is not reaching workers. And I hope that at least what's on paper in the OECD guidelines, together with what I hope the field, whether that's capital or labor, is seeing in terms of these what we can call like hard law or legal liability approaches, the joint employer approach, for example. I'm hoping that these tougher forms of legal accountability will drive stakeholders to actually come to the table more seriously in OECD to address violations of the OECD guidelines, because that really is the need. I know the joint liability cases are tremendously important, but that we also see they take an incredibly long time, and justice has been delayed too long for these workers, and it's incredibly difficult to go through legal processes as well. And maybe that's the hope of the OECD, that it can provide a forum where quickly in crisis situations, or even just in crisis situations, we can get relief, we can get dialogue and relief ultimately for workers that's a little bit speedier than these long legal processes that, although that we are seeing, are incredibly essential to bring everyone to the table in a more serious way. Nivedita, I know we're short on time. I know I could talk to Ashim all day about this, but I think I should turn it back over to you.
No, thanks. Thanks so much. It was such an engaging conversation that, really brought together so many aspects on brand accountability and addressing inequalities in supply chains. I think we are at the end of the session now. And to close, I want to reiterate that, the pandemic has very clearly shown us that we have enough and more evidence to prove that it is really the actions of brands and their purchasing practices that have created labor, gender, and human rights violations in Asia, kept workers in poverty, and pushed them even deeper into a humanitarian crisis during the pandemic. We already know the demands of the labor movement. We know that there are strategies and solutions that workers and the unions have developed. We know that brand liability is the need of the hour, and we know that Global South governments must be provided with capacity and sensitization so that they're activated and they move from regional competition to hold brands liable as joint employers of workers. We know that these policy spaces and global institutions that are located in the global north must center these important demands and solutions that are being offered by the Global South labor movement and support their efforts. The need of the hour to convert the tragedy created by the pandemic into an opportunity to build just supply chains is to act towards strengthening brand liability. If we act now, we have the opportunity to make supply chains vehicles for change, for the development of the Global South, for gender equality and empowerment, for ending intergenerational poverty. And for that, we must push for the regulation of supply chains, as well as for the redistribution of wealth back to workers and to production countries in the form of living wages. And the way to achieve this, we're hearing from the Asian labor movement, is through brand liability. Thank you to all our panelists for joining us today and for these valuable discussions, and for our audience for staying with us and listening to what we have to say, and the wonderful team at AFWA and GLJ who made this even possible through all their background work. Thank you to all. Have a good day or good night. Thanks a lot.